Hello and welcome everyone. I am Yvonne Kim, Executive Director of Asia Society Korea. Our discussion today is organized in commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Korean War, and we are honored to welcome another group of distinguished guests. We have General Chun with us, former Deputy Commander for the 1st U.S. Army, who has held various notable positions in the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, the Korean Special Warfare Command, the ROK Army Chief of Staff Office, and the Korean Ministry of National Defense. Even though he is retired, he remains active on Korean politics and military relations, and he is calling in today to join us from Stockholm. Next, we have His Excellency Harry Harris, the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea. As many of you are aware, he's a former U.S. Navy officer and was the first American of Japanese descent to lead U.S. Pacific Command and the first Asian American to hold 4-star rank in the U.S. Navy. We have His Excellency Simon Smith, the British Ambassador to the Republic of Korea, joining us too. He previously served as British Ambassador to Ukraine and to Austria, where he was also the UK Permanent Representative to UN and international organizations in Vienna, and the UK Governor on the board of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I would like to particularly thank Ambassador Smith for actually suggesting a couple of months ago that we put a discussion together to talk about the Korean War veterans to sustain memory and understanding of the Korean War and its meaning, and here we are. Today's discussion will be moderated by Andrew Salmon, a Seoul-based English journalist whose books on the Korean War, including Scorched Earth, Black Snow, and To the Last Round, have garnered a Korea Wave Award from South Korea's National Assembly and a member of the British Empire Award from Queen Elizabeth II. The discussion will last about 25 minutes, then we'll move to Q&A. May I please ask those of you in the audience to keep your video off and stay muted to not interfere with the speakers. Please submit your questions through the chat box at any time. We will monitor these and call upon you to introduce yourself and to ask the question out loud. If you do not wish to ask your question out loud, please say so in the chat box and the moderator will read it himself. I'll now hand over the mic to Andrew Salmon. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning. Thank you, Yvonne. Now, 2020, of course, is a grim year for us all as COVID-19 culls populations worldwide. We've already suffered more than 1 million deaths in the wide family of humanity. But it's somber for another reason. This is, of course, the 50th anniversary year of the outbreak of the Korean War, a war that killed even more people than COVID has thus far in a much smaller geography, the Korean Peninsula. It's a war that's significant today for many, many reasons. Many would say it was a great failure of US and Western foreign policy, but one could arguably say it was also a great success given the long-term post-facto outcome for South Korea. It was the first war America couldn't win. It was also the war that marked the emergence of China as a superpower. Perhaps most significantly, it's still with us today. Northeast Asia has this black hole in the center of it, a war that could reignite at any moment with a nuclear-armed North Korea. So one of the most significant foreign policy challenges of our time. But today we're not here to talk about the generals or the politicians. We're here to talk about the veterans themselves, who are now, of course, in their twilight years. A young soldier who was 20 in 1950 would be 90 today. And this year could have been the last hurrah for Korean War veterans. Many were expected to visit the country they defended for a last visit. And of course, that didn't happen due to the COVID-19 situation. So today we would like to pay some tributes to those veterans, discuss the legacies of the Korean War for these three countries, the United States, South Korea, and the UK. We can begin. Both the ambassadors would like to make a personal statement to camera. I'll begin with Ambassador Harris. Ambassador, the camera is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Allow me to begin by thanking the Asia Society, Korea, for inviting me to be part of this informative webinar today to commemorate the heroes who made it possible for all of us to be here now. Let me also thank Executive Director Kim, who arranged for me to meet KDCA Commissioner Jung virtually yesterday on the Society's behalf. Thank you, Yvonne. Today's webinar gives people like me an opportunity to express our enormous gratitude to the brave men and women who served and sacrificed in the defense of democracy during the Korean War. Today, we recognize the incredible act of solidarity by all UN sending states whose soldiers fought alongside their Korean brothers and sisters to preserve freedom. We will never forget their sacrifices, and we will always be grateful for them. 70 years ago, the idea of the Republic of Korea, indeed the idea of democracy on the Korean Peninsula, was not set in stone. The North Korean invasion that began that fateful Sunday 70 years ago caught a nation and a world by surprise. Only 3 days later, North Korea had captured Seoul. Just a little over a week later, U.S. Marines leading the UN force joined the battle. It was a grim time as UN sending state and ROK forces took heavy casualties in a frantic effort to stem the DPRK advance. Not until General Douglas MacArthur's Incheon landing on September 15, 1950, did the tide really begin to turn. By the end of 1953, the shared sacrifices of South Koreans and the UN sending states ensured that democracy on half the Korean Peninsula had survived at such a bloody cost. Fast forward 70 years, and it's clear that democracy has triumphed on that half of the Korean Peninsula. The Republic of Korea has more than survived, it has thrived. The ROK has become a democracy and economy that's a beacon for the region and the world. Look no further than the April general elections that Korea held. At the height of the first wave of the pandemic, ensuring the safety and democracy work hand in hand. Indeed, the U.S. National Association of Election Officials reached out to the ROK for advice on conducting an election during a pandemic. The UN sending state troops led by the United States who participated in the ROK's defense, those who have served here since then, and those serving here now should be proud of the fact that they helped lay the groundwork for the miracle on the Han. Referring just to the U.S. for a moment, as the Republic of Korea rose from the shambles of war and evolved into a brilliant success, so too has the U.S.-ROK relationship evolved and grown. Our alliance today is a multi-dimensional partnership reinforced by shared concerns, shared values, and common economic interests, all underpinned by multiple generations of deep people-to-people ties. Today, many in the U.S. are seeing firsthand the advantages of partnering in science and technology with a dynamic innovation nation like the Republic of Korea and are directly benefiting from Korea's successful response to COVID-19. The ROK government's response to the pandemic has been lauded as a global example, and rightly so. Follow the rules and follow the science. Seems simple in concept, but hard in execution. The ROK has made both work. So let me give a well-deserved shout out to Director of the Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency, Yvonne Kim. During his recent visit to Seoul, Deputy Secretary of State Steve Biegun took special care to convey how grateful to South Korea and how touched we Americans are for your generous donation of personal protective equipment to U.S. veterans who served in the Korean War. We continue to remember those bonds forged in blood that have flowered into friendship and a strengthened partnership. So I'm deeply grateful to all of those who are striving to build a strong U.S.-ROK alliance, who work to preserve and strengthen our democracy on the Korean Peninsula. I look forward to fruitful discussions during the seminar. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Let's go directly to Ambassador Simon Smith from the UK. Ambassador, the camera is yours.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever else you are in the world, or good evening, good night. And many thanks to the Aegis Society for giving us this opportunity for getting together this morning. I'm going to cut things very short in my opening remarks. I'm going to use the well-tried formula in international diplomacy to say that I fully associate myself with the remarks of the US Ambassador, Harry Harris, and perhaps not go over the same ground. I want to start just by sharing a very personal thought. the famous physicist Isaac Newton is supposed to have said, uttered the phrase, "I stand on the shoulders of giants." And what he meant there was that in all the discoveries that he made, he didn't do this himself. He had help. He was standing on the shoulders of people he referred to as giants, who helped him to see and helped him to understand. Now, I don't claim to any achievements anywhere remotely near those of Isaac Newton, but I do feel that I stand on the shoulders of giants when I do my job here in Korea. And those giants are the veterans, are the guys who came here, the women who were part of the effort as well, to participate in the defense of Korea in the Korean War. And as I tell the veterans, the British veterans, when they come back to Korea, when I hear so often the appreciation here in Korea, the gratitude, when I see the generosity of the Korean authorities in welcoming them back to Korea, I am filled with a very sincere feeling that these are people whose shoulders I stand on as I do my work here in Korea. And quite simply, I tell them the things that you people did 70 years ago are still making my job easier to do. They are still powering a wonderful relationship between the United Kingdom and Korea, even 70 years on. So that's my personal tribute of thanks to the veterans, just to start our process, our proceedings today. Thank you.
Ambassadors, thank you both very much. Let me ask my first question then to General Chun. General, as a fighting man yourself, you know how tough the Korean War was. It was an unusually brutal war. It was fought in harsh conditions on mountains, which made casualty evacuation very, very difficult, in muddy paddy fields, in devastated villages. You're well aware, I'm sure, of how most of the fighting took place at night, particularly against the Chinese troops, the so-called human wave. So the most traumatic form of battle, close-range combat in darkness, face-to-face against massive odds. What is your personal message, if you have one, you'd like to deliver to the soldiers who fought 70 years ago under the war banner of the UN command?
So, Andy, I must echo both ambassadors in saying my appreciation to the Asia Society for making this opportunity. It's a treat for me to represent the Korean people today at this event to say a few words on behalf to the veterans. And what else could it be but a message of great gratitude? I myself served 38 years in uniform, and during those 38 years, I was deployed to Somalia as the first team to start the Korean peacekeeping operations in '93. Then I was sent to Iraq for 7 months to work with the multinational forces in Iraq. And then I went to Afghanistan for a couple of months for some other operations. And every day that I spent in those days, I reminded myself of how terrible it must have been for not only the Koreans, but the UN troops that had to deploy during that hot summer and very, very cold winter of 50 and 51 through 53. So to these veterans, I would just want to say thank you. We Koreans have repaid this sacrifice as being a contributor to the world and as a society that is so dynamic. And we are a very, very diverse people. And I just want to say that every smile that you see in this country and every laughter that you hear in this country is because of your sacrifice. And it's something that, although not all Koreans might appreciate it, they should really take heart into these kinds of feelings. So thank you to the veterans, and you are not forgotten.
Thank you very much for that. Ambassadors, as you know, many commemorations were planned in Korea for this year to bring over some of the last elderly veterans. Unfortunately, of course, that didn't happen because of COVID. Could you tell us what may have happened in your countries this year in remembrance of the Korean War and in honor of Korean War veterans? Ambassador Harris, do you want to kick off?
Thanks, Andrew. We had a number of commemorations in the United States, most centered around the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., a very moving memorial dedicated to the memories of those who fought during the war. I know that there were a lot of webinar events where Korean War veterans, American Korean War veterans, were brought into venues like the Korea Society in New York and venues like that, so they could participate also in gala events commemorating the beginning of the Korean War. I echo your disappointment that many were not able to travel to Korea, not only from the United States, but really from all the sending states. I think we have another opportunity over the next 2 years to bring to Korea these veterans, especially in 2 years for the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War and the beginning of the armistice. So, we should look to those events and hope that the COVID situation is manageable globally, and then perhaps we'll see more veterans here over the course of the next 2 years. But I do want to commend the Republic of Korea for their truly extraordinary efforts to ensure that the veterans and their contributions are never forgotten. And so hats off to them for doing that. Thanks.
Thank you. Ambassador Smith?
Yeah, a very similar picture in the UK. I think quite a lot of things that might have gone on that were prevented from doing so by the pandemic. But we had a couple of sort of central commemorative events. One on the 25th of June itself at the National Memorial Arboretum near Lichfield in the UK, in England. And one at the memorial behind the Ministry of Defence, or in front of the Ministry of Defence, between the Ministry of Defence and the River Thames in London. And it was also really good to see that at least two of the national newspapers in the UK came out with 70th anniversary stories on the Korean War. And it's fair to say that, and I think probably quite correctly, that one of the themes of those stories was, again, to address the proposition of, is this the forgotten war? But I think that what was really encouraging was that in the media focus, and I think in one or two of the commemorative events, that there was a good effort to try to contradict that assertion that the Korean War is the forgotten war. But as I said, I think probably less real-time, active, participative commemoration than we'd have liked to have seen. And we very much hope that the situation around the pandemic will clear up quickly enough for us to be able to do a little bit more. Of course, the Korean War started in 1950, but didn't finish till 1953. In that sense, we're in a 3-year period of commemorations. And I really hope that during that 3-year period, there'll be time for us and there'll be opportunity for us to do some more participative, real-time commemoration with the involvement of the veterans.
Thanks. General Chun, it often strikes me that Korea in 1950 was a very alien land to most members of the UN command. Many people literally hadn't heard of the country before they were deployed here. It was a poor land. It was a brutal war. It was a devastated place. And many people, I think, were very, very happy to leave this country and perhaps expect never to see or hear from it again. And yet today, if we look at South Korea, I think if you picked up South Korea and sort of magically airlifted it into the United States or into Western Europe, the Korean people today would fit perfectly into either of those societies in terms of their beliefs, their behaviors, their values, their aspirations. In other words, South Koreans are no longer an alien, devastated nation. They're very much an important member of the global family of nations. And yet, in 1953, the war ended pretty much along the line it had started. It wasn't a victory. Again, speaking as a military man, for the UN soldiers, did they win a victory or did they suffer a defeat? What would you consider the legacy of 1953?
In direct answer to your question, the soldiers won the war. The politicians did what politicians always do. And, I won't say further. But the soldiers did their best and they did their job. They followed orders and they sacrificed. And at this stage, I just want to remind everyone that for the United States, for example, 37,000 dead during the Korean War. But it wasn't as if the 37,000 were equally killed during the 3 years. During the first 6 months, nearly 100 men died every day. And the first 6 months, the troops from the UK and other UN nations, their sacrifice and their misery was terrifying. And yet they did their job. So although we might have ended up where we started in the geographical terms, I believe sincerely that the soldiers did their job. And because they did their job, look what's happening in Korea right now. There's a lot of things going on. It's not resolved yet, but we have the freedom to do what we do now. And it's that kind of sacrifice, that kind of grit that will allow Korea to be a better nation that will contribute to the world. And I think that that is the greatest legacy of the UN forces. And I believe that when I say UN forces, it includes the many hundreds of thousands of Korean soldiers as well.
Of course, of course. I mean, coming back to the utter grimness of this war, which you just referenced, particularly in its early period, we saw for example, that this iconic battle, the breakout from Changjinho, from the Chosin Reservoir, when the U.S. Marine Division, with attachments from the Rock Army and the Royal Marines, broke out through 70 miles of mountains, hacking their way through 8 Chinese divisions in absolutely hideous conditions of combat. And this, of course, has become a particularly a famous or legendary stand for the U.S. Marine Corps. Equally for the British Army, the Battle of the Imjin River in April 1951, where a British brigade held off an entire Chinese army for 3 nights of extraordinary combat, great intensity, and yet we lost 1 battalion, the Glorious Gloucesters, who were surrounded, cut off, and eventually destroyed on Hill 235. And yet, if we fast forward to today, let me ask Ambassador Harris, what would you consider to be the role of the UN command? The UN, of course, has changed radically since 1950 to today. And it's not clear to me exactly whether the sending states are now committed to returning to Korea if there was a resumption of hostilities. In your opinion, what then should be the role of the United Nations Command, given, of course, that the United States is committed to Korea's defense with a mutual defense treaty, but for the sending states, this body, the UN Command, what is its relevance today?
It's a great question, and it's a question that that's being asked often in the Republic, especially in the media. The principal mission for the UN command is to maintain the armistice that was set down as a mission set at the end of the Korean War, and to manage activities in the joint security area. It is not a combatant command. It does not have forces. It no longer commands forces. It turned over command of forces to the Combined Forces Command back in the 70s. And so the CFC is the warfighting command for the ROK and US forces. The UN command is a separate entity, again, that manages the armistice. It will also help in the RSONI, the reception, staging, and onward integration of sending state forces into the peninsula once, if hostilities begin again. Whether the individual sending states would send forces should the armistice end and the conflict begin anew, that's up to the sending states and other countries that might participate, but the UN command has a very relevant role today, and certainly is geared for it's certainly geared for relevance should conflict begin anew.
Okay, thanks. Well, let me go across on that point to Ambassador Smith. I mean, British veterans have said right here in Korea, if the war broke out again, we would fight again. But of course, that's the statement of men who are in their 70s at the time. What is the position of the British government? Were hostilities to break out again in Korea, would British soldiers deploy to fight alongside their South Korean and American allies on this peninsula once more?
Well, Andy, I think you will understand that you will not get an answer to a sort of what if question of that kind in terms of military deployments. But I think that in a sense, to sort of slightly answer your question by coming back to your first question about what the UN command is there for, absolutely, it's not there under an assumption that the command that was got together in 1950 would rapidly reassemble and go back into combat in the same formats and in the same proportions as it did in those days. In the extremely unwanted event that the risk of conflict were to rise again on the Korean Peninsula, it's pretty clear that all governments with an interest in the region, all governments with an interest in global peace and security would want to look at the conditions very carefully and would want to consider what is going to be the best step forward in terms of maximizing the chances for either preventing conflict or stopping it quickly and reverting to a position where at least there is an opportunity to build peace and security on the peninsula and more widely, rather than see it break down. But I think that, again, to come back to your first question about the UN command, I do see the UN command as an opportunity for a number of nations to stay committed, to stay focused on the peninsula, and to stay engaged. And I'm sure that it has, over the years, very much helped to concentrate the minds of policymakers and decision makers on defense and security issues in the United Kingdom, to know that they have, in a sense, a sort of ringside seat. They have engagement. They have people whose job it has been to develop expertise in what's going on. And even though, in many senses, as Ambassador Harris says, the original role as perceived for the UN command was to supervise the armistice, that still is sort of very much in place in principle. But I think we had to remind ourselves that in practice, some of those roles have changed a lot. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the Military Armistice Commission itself, as originally constituted, has not met since 1993 or 4. And that, some of the roles, some of the functions have very much changed. But I think in terms of an opportunity to stay engaged, stay informed, and stay ready, I think it has a powerful sense in continuing to exist.
Okay, so the changing role of the UNC. We've just got a question from the floor from one of our viewers, which I'll present to the three of you. And let's start with General Chun. How is the Korean War presented in your education systems? What's the, what is taught about the Korean War in textbooks to children today? General, why don't you kick off?
In the old days, it used to be very clear-cut. North Korea invaded a peaceful South Korea. The world came to our help. We almost had unification. The Chinese intervened, and we have a divided country. Then various views came into play. And in war, there are mistakes, and in hindsight, there are regrets. And as we focused on those kinds of mistakes and things that were not conducted in the right way, it kind of blurred the fact that North Korea, especially Kim Il-sung, and his supporters, namely the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union, Stalin, supported this war. Now, no matter what the motives were, maybe Kim had a motive of grandly unifying the Korean people, but to use force and to consequently lead to over 1 million Korean deaths. I mean, why do we want unification in the first place? It's for the people, and he just did not meet those goals. But anyway, in the textbooks right now, I think there are diverse opinions, which is fine. But I'm a little concerned as a Korean that the main message, which is the Koreans, the North Koreans used force to reach peace, which is ridiculous. And this is a very concerning part of what I see in Korean society. Now, having said that, there are people, good-hearted people who are working to make sure that that message stays alive. And I believe that the webinar that we are doing right now is a testament to that kind of effort. And it is only possible, again, because of the great sacrifices by the veterans that we honor at this moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you make a very good point, which is that a democracy must be a plurality. There must be diversity of opinion. And so an increasing sophistication of the narrative rather than simple black and white makes perfect sense within the framework of democratic governments and education. Ambassador Harris, what do American kids learn about the Korean War?
Well, I'd have to reach back 50 years in my own memory. I don't have children, so I don't know what kids are learning these days. I started high school in 1970, and high school is where you really get into beginning a real study of history, world history, local history, international relations, that kind of stuff. Then you go on from there. So in high school, when I was a student, the Korean War was painted as the first battle in the long struggle of the Cold War. So it was pitched with that backdrop in mind. And there are geopolitical issues, that they touch on in schools. But it was really like General Chun was saying, this is a Stalinist and communist Chinese effort to forcibly reunify the peninsula, and the United States and the sending states came to the aid of South Korea and prevented that from happening. And it's kind of, I think it's painted in that kind of a factual context. Only when you get into college and later on do you start to explore other issues. But I'm concerned now, 70 years on from the beginning of the war, that there's a sense of revisionist history, that somehow South Korea and North Korea are equivalents. And it's just that the South Koreans had all the help from the United States and the UK and others, and the North Koreans had all the help from the communists in the Soviet Union and in China. And, we drew the parallel at 38th parallel, drew the line at 38th parallel. But it's not a sense of moral equivalence between the two halves of Korea at the time of the outbreak of the war, and certainly after.
Right.
And so we have to be alert, as General Chun said, we have to be alert to these attempts at somehow to equate both countries, because it was a completely different premise that caused the North to invade the South and the Chinese to come to the North's aid than it was for the sending states to come to the aid of South Korea.
Sure. And I couldn't agree with you more. I do wonder every year what the Chinese veterans think of the country they defended, which, unlike South Korea, is not a member of the family of nations. Its only real relevance is as a security threat, as the possessor of strategic weapons. It isn't a country. It's promoted itself as an economy, as an exporter, as a supplier of great public figures, UN Secretary Generals to British football stars. And of course, it's a great exporter of its pop culture. So I think most people around the world would agree with you that South Korea has been the post facto success. North Korea has been a much more of a post facto disaster. Ambassador Smith, coming back to the original question, what, if anything, do British children learn about the war, which actually was a bloodier war for the British Army than the Falklands War, Iran and Afghanistan combined?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start with a personal memory, because if you ask me what my memories of what I learned in school about the Korean War, they're very much characterized by the fact that one of my primary school teachers had fought in the Korean War. I don't, to be honest, remember very much that he told us in detail about the war. Maybe he didn't tell us much in detail. Maybe I wasn't listening too carefully. But certainly he was very keen. I think what sticks in my memory was how keen he was to battle against this sort of forgotten war syndrome. And what the message that we got from him was to say, the episodes in which the British Armed Forces were deployed in combat did not stop in 1945. Now, this was 1965 or 66 by this time, so it wasn't that long after the Korean War had ended. But even at that point, as I say, what my memory tells me, that there was this concern that the Korean War was a slightly sort of kind of short, overlooked episode in history when compared to the 1939 to 45 war. But just following up on a more kind of general assessment of what's taught in schools, I mean, I think that the central narrative about the Korean War in British education, particularly looking further at sort of high school education and so on, I think it's very firmly centered in the sort of Cold War context. And I think that it's presented as a war when the issue of why it was that the British government at the time in June 1950 was pretty quick to get to form a position in the UN Security Council to support the resolution that formed the UN command to fight the Korean War. I think that what is now kind of, I think, pretty mainstream assumption is that the decision making of the British government then was guided very heavily by the realization that not many years after the end of the Second World War, we were into another completely different confrontational dynamic, and that confrontation between the sort of ideologies of the free world and the communist world was very much on people's minds as they made that decision. I think that that was not something that people were just waking up to in 1950. I think the Berlin blockade from mid-1948 had really started, really probably caused a great sort of lurch forward in the consciousness in countries like the UK that they were in another confrontational dynamic. And I think that really set the scene for, as I say, the very quick decision making that happened once the question was brought to the Security Council in New York.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you make the point, this took part within the wider framework of the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War is very largely a thing of the past. I think one could make the point the Cold War was won by the West largely through economic, not military means. But of course, now the Cold War's over, we're seeing a new challenge. We are seeing a rising China, a very self-confident China, at a time when the West is consumed by self-loathing, by chaos, by internal division. The European Union seems unable to act effectively in foreign policy. The UK is Brexiting out of the European Union, and it seems like there's no appetite for any form of sort of military adventure by the United States. What should be done looking forward to counter China's presence in this region by the democracies? And I'll throw that open to the floor. Ambassador Harris, Ambassador Smith or General Chun, go for it.
I'm going to defer to Ambassador Smith, and then I'll follow him because he's followed me lately.
Okay, the gauntlet has been held down. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Harry, for dumping me in it. No, I think that to go to just to sort of pinpoint one element of your question, Andy. You talked about a sort of new confrontation, and I think one mistake we shouldn't make is to approach this on the assumption that a confrontation is inevitable. Sure, I think some very fundamental disagreements in outlook, disagreements in political philosophy, if you like, and I think very contrasting positions in terms of the respect for and the value, the sort of evaluation of universal principles and basic freedoms and basic rights and so on. And that, I think, is where our starting point should be. I think that it is very necessary for countries which put value on basic freedoms, on the fundamental human freedoms and rights that are set out in the basic texts like the Universal Declaration. I have muted myself accidentally. The basic principles that are set out in these overarching declarations, the UN Charter, the Fundamental Declaration on Human Rights, and so on. I think there is a need for us actually to pull together and conduct a more robust defense of those fundamental freedoms. And I do agree with what was implied in your question, Andy, that the capacity of those nations which purport to subscribe to those fundamental values has in the last few years been looked as though it has been worryingly weakened. So I think there is a need for us to come together and focus again on how we more effectively defend those basic principles, how we reassert the value of an international system of kind of rules-based conduct. But I think my last point is to say I also think there is a great opportunity for us to focus on those issues where the realization is becoming almost totally global, that we have to act together and in a coordinated way. And there is no issue which is more fitting of that description than the issue of climate change and the climate crisis. And I do think that we may be just about to enter, we've seen actually some really extraordinarily visionary targets set actually by China, Japan, and South Korea in the last couple of months or so. And I think that helps, as I say, it helps us all to focus that we may be just embarking on a new age where we will all find that there is this absolutely essential objective that we have to commit to in a cooperative way, because if we don't commit to it in a cooperative way, we are heading for a big disaster.
Understood. Unfortunately, we've pretty much run out of time now. We're going to have to call this to an end. Let me make one very, very, very short statement, and let's return to our original topic, which is honoring the veterans of the United Nations Command. I would like to say to you, if any of you are watching, as a resident of the Republic of Korea, someone who has a daughter here, and someone who's written extensively on your battles, let me just offer you this from the Book of Common Prayer. The long day is ended, fever of life is over, and your duty is done. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That concludes today's program. General Chun, Ambassador Harris, Ambassador Smith, and Andy, a big thanks to all of you for taking your time to join us today. I also wanted to share that in addition to our recent recognition of the Korean Disease Control Prevention Agency with the Cultural and Diplomacy Award, we also had a webinar yesterday on the open source Intel Revolution, the democratization of imagery analysis on North Korea. We also had a discussion last week about US-China relations after the 2020 US presidential election and its impact on Korea. They're all available on our website now, and I think all of you might find it interesting. Also, thanks to all of you in the audience again for joining us from all around the globe. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. And until next time, please stay safe, everyone. Thank you again, and goodbye.